Hi, welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm KC Scott, your host, and my guest today is Roget Lockard, a highly esteemed addictions counselor, and we've been having a series of discussions on the nature of addiction. I think this is our 14th conversation. Roget, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Casey.
Always a pleasure to have you here. Now, when we concluded our last program, we were talking about the 12 steps, and we had gotten to step 6. And I introduced step 6 by also including step 7, even though they're not one step. And the reason I include step 7 initially is because they sound like one step to the uninformed. So I'm going to read those 2 steps again and see if we can get a little clarity on that. Step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, following on our personal inventory. Step 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. So that's where we left it now. Help us out with why that's broken down in that manner and where that leads us.
Well, to be frivolous for a moment, it may be because someone wanted to preserve the AA trivial fact that step 7 is the only step that has the same number as the number of words in the step. But maybe not.
Okay. That's pretty good AA trivia, but I don't know that it advances the discussion.
Oh, I don't know. I can't speak for what was in the minds of the people when the process of apprehending the steps as they emerged in their reflections as the big book of AA was being written. But the logic of it that jumps out for me is that the 2 processes are events of it's an enormous shift of I'm going to call it shift of gravity, although I'm not sure I'm satisfied with that. But it really is a shift from, as we mentioned in the last show, from focusing on discovering who am I to making the focus more on how can I be faithful to who I've discovered myself to be. And thus, the becoming entirely ready to have these defects removed is a kind of closing of that process, a kind of a completion of that process. And for me, there is, even if once one gets past the seeming implausibility of ever arriving at that place, what do you mean entirely ready? Which I expect we'll talk about a bit.
Yes.
But once one gets past that and is not threatened or intimidated by it, becoming entirely ready, there's almost something meditative about that. And for me, there's a great pause. Okay, entirely ready, which I think you will find has a lot of implications. But just in its raw assertion, there's a kind of, oh, okay, and a kind of a peacefulness, if you will. It's certainly congruent with all the different ways in which the first 6 steps have incorporated the dynamic, the orientation that perhaps is most vividly articulated in the 3rd step, which is about surrender. And that the eloquence and elegance of this notion of having these steps removed, it's not getting rid of these steps.
Character,
it's not
character defects.
The character defects
Yes.
removed, exactly. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I have to tell you that I ran across someone wearing a hat one time that reorganized parts of 2 of the steps as follows. We made a list of all the people we had harmed, which is coming up in the near future, and humbly asked God to remove them.
I have seen that.
Yes. So, but the basic dynamic, the feel of the 6th step, is of a kind of really turning it over. And as we'll see in the 7th step.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because when you pointed out in our last conversation that step 5 begins with the word admitted, as does step 1. I reflected on that at some length and noticed a certain resonance between the first 3 steps and steps 5, 6, and 7. Because there is that taking in of that realization, and then there's a shift of consciousness which leads to a step of commitment. And I thought that was a very interesting resonance between those 2, and points to, in a sense, to that shift that you're talking about.
One of the things that has intrigued me over the years, more and more, is that you can take any of the ways that 12 can be divided and come up with an even number, and find really provocative and enlightening, illuminating sequences of meaning, so that 1 and 2 have their own affinity, 3 and 4 do, as we were talking in a recent conversation, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and so forth. But 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, etc.
Or you can do 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 5. It is interesting, the different geometries that you can come up with, and how it does inform
but that's,
different
of course,
understanding.
That's, of course, for someone who has found the subjects worthy enough to spend that kind of attention.
Which hopefully we have, but so there is that problem in step 6 of entirely ready, and it's hard to imagine anybody approaching this without reservation and without saying, well, you know, I'm willing to give up this character defect and that character defect, but gosh, I sure want to hold on to this one.
A couple of thoughts. One, of course, is the constant reminder that we need to come back to, which is, it doesn't say we rid ourselves of these. It says we were ready to have them removed.
Yes.
And then, of course, in the 7th step, humbly asked to have them removed. So there's that, but there's also, as far as being entirely ready, probably the single most liberating or freeing conceptual orientation that has come to me with regard to this business of entirely ready was listening to a friend of mine talk about being at an AA step meeting. And the step they were focused on was number 6, and as is evidently often the case, that question of entirely ready tended to preoccupy a lot of the participants. Until it came to one gentleman who said, you know, I struggled with this for a long time, and I was talking with my sponsor about it. I don't know if we've talked about AA sponsors, but there is
I don't believe so.
It's the enlistment of a more experienced member to help one advance one's own sobriety. So this gentleman said, I was talking to my sponsor about my difficulty with this idea of being entirely ready. And he said, you know, John, after you had been in your mother's womb for 9 months, you were entirely ready to be born. That doesn't mean you wanted to be born. And that got me thinking, because I realized that in my own journey in sobriety and in life in general, I have noticed the difference in how life plays out and how, and in effect, how the price tag changes. Mm-hmm. As one clings to, we can call them character defects, willful attitudes, whatever it may be, fear-based, essentially, is what we're talking about. But after one really sees through them and appreciates that they're not a necessity in the way that they quite possibly seemed earlier, but we're comforted by them, whatever it may be, and so we cling to them, and consequences ensue, as they always have. But after we've arrived at that place of readiness, the consequences become more draconian, more severe.
Or at least more noticeable.
Or both, yeah. But I don't think of it at all as, an avenging higher power saying, all right, well, then you're going to get punished for this. It's just the flow of again, not being whole with ourselves. If this is indeed the kind of the point where you could see the steps as turning from coming to know oneself to learning how to be faithful to oneself, then that's precisely where this consciousness starts to become keen. Mm-hmm. It's like, wait a second, I know better than this. Mm. And I think one of the key differentiations that happens when we move into the consciousness of knowing ourselves, imperfectly of course, but with a certain kind of wholeness, because we've systematically been investing in it, is that earlier when we screw up, to use clinical language, and then we become aware of that, we tend to be embarrassed. Once we develop a real awareness of who we are and who we aren't, mm-hmm. when we screw up, we tend to be ashamed. Mm. Because the first one, embarrassment, is about how other people view me.
Right.
Shame is about healthy shame. I'm not talking about the toxic shame.
The toxic shame, no.
No,
we
but
yep.
the healthy shame of, I know that I don't believe in this, and yet I've gone ahead and done it.
Right.
I think we might have talked about the difference between
we
toxic
did.
and healthy shame in an early
we went
program.
Into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a slightly different perspective on this now, listening to what you're saying, because we've been talking all along about self, and mm-hmm. and initially the addictive enterprise was about controlling self. I recall in my own experience, long before I picked up a drink. When I was a teenager, I decided that I would will who I would be, that I would create myself. And that was a conscious decision. It was not something I stumbled into.
As a teenager,
As a teenager,
mm-hmm.
yes. Now we're talking about discovering self. This is not something I create. Mm-hmm. This is mm-hmm. discovering who I am, mm-hmm. Who I was created to be, if you want to say that. So that's a very interesting. If it's the attempt to manage self that gets us into trouble, then it's this attempt to discover self that leads us out of it.
You know, I'm going to do something that might have some viewers saying, well, I thought this guy had credibility, but I take it all back. And I'm going to share that one of the biggest surprises of my life, period, was early in my sobriety back in the mid-1970s, and very much against my fundamental belief system. I made the discovery that the system of correspondence that is called astrology works. It has viability. And that provoked a lot of re-examining on my part, and it's been a very fruitful area of exploration ever since then. But the reason I mention that right now is because, understandably, people are very leery of the notion that, oh, okay, so you've got this little pie chart on a piece of paper, and that's your birth chart, your natal chart, whatever it is. And so you can't ever, you're locked into just one set of possibilities for your life, and it's already laid out. In effect, a kind of arcane determinism. But in the course of this study, in conjunction with my spiritual journey and sobriety and other, explorations in philosophy and life and so forth, what has actually happened is that the sense of possibility has become more coherent, but infinitely more varied. And my favorite analogy to elicit those seeming discrepancies is the fact that crystals in nature form according to the molecular structure of the compound or element that they are made of. And in the case of some crystals are complex, the molecules are complex enough so that they can be very form in several different ways. But in the case of water, there's only one way that they can form. So that would seem to be enormously limiting. But in fact, we have as a truism that no two snow crystals are the same.
Yes.
And so the analogy here is that while every snow crystal is absolutely faithful to the molecular rules of its composition, no two are alike. And so while every manifestation of myself in my life will always be faithful to the patterns, I really have to say, of the astrological correspondences that can be examined, the variety, the variability is beyond number. And it's a fascinating study to see how different things are when I join my consciousness to striving for, I'm going to borrow that word we've used before, for wholesome realizations of my potential as distinct from fear-based, willful manifestations.
I find in my own journey that there's certain things about which I did not choose. I did not choose my talents. To a certain extent, I did not choose my interests. And this journey of discovering who I am is also discovering who I am not. So what are within the parameters of who I am, that is basically the domain of my ability to express that. So, does that make sense? I'm not being very articulate here, but I see what you're getting at with that.
So, to come back to rein us in, so that viewers don't get too alarmed at this flight into esoterica. I think earlier in discussing the fourth and fifth step process, I think I made mention of the notion that a very succinct way of characterizing character defects and character assets are to say that character defects are those patterns of behavior and interpretation that are organized around our experiences of fear and mistrust. And that our character assets are those patterns of behavior and interpretation that are organized around our experiences of love and trust. And so I see this, again, this pivot point of steps 6 and 7 as where we are consciously giving over, if you will, arriving in a state of readiness in 6, and then giving over to higher power, whatever that means for us.
Whatever that is, yes.
Right.
On an individual basis.
The fear-based ways of being in life. And in so doing, we clear the stage, if you will, for the very important and what becomes wonderful work, even though looked at from some distance it seems like it's going to be just dreadful and appalling, but the wonderful, incredible healing work of the next couple of steps, or of 8, yes,
8
and 9,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah. So, but before we move on to that, I just want to, apropos of what you just said, point out, as you did earlier, that the step, I lost my place, here it is, that the step says, humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings, not that I'm going to remove my shortcomings,
exactly.
but to have them removed.
Right.
Yeah. So that's, there again, it's that relinquishing of control.
I often, in working with clients, I often use gestures a fair amount, and I like to point out the difference between this and this, or this, either one, because this is very labor intensive, whereas this is a relinquishment of labor. It's letting go of holding on.
Yes, it's relaxing the muscles rather than...
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And this is, of course, an offering, to take it.
Very good. So are we ready to move on to step 8, I think?
Well, if we're not, we'll come back and pick up the pieces, but I don't see why not.
All right. So step 8 says, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Not to humbly ask them to be removed, but as you as the joke was made earlier, but
yes.
became willing to make amends to them all. Every one of these steps has its own hurdle to get over, but this seems like on the one hand, an enormous barrier, and on the other hand, it's like, didn't I already do that in step 4?
My answer to that is I hope not. Since step 4 is really a private, reflective self-examination, and if let me stop and say that these steps, in fact, emerge in our lives organically. And I believe I mentioned way early in our series that I have never run into anyone who was sober for a month in a really earnest way, who hasn't had some truck, if you will, with each of the steps. So I don't mean to say that, no, you can't have anything to do with making amends with anybody until you've gone through blah, blah, blah. But if they've systematically undertaken to do amends work as part of step 4, I think they've made what was probably a very well-intended mistake, but a meaningful one.
Yes, I understand that, but we're talking about making the list now.
Right, making a list of people we had harmed.
Right.
Yeah. Well, of course, as you will remember, we talked about the difference between the people who use the big book version of making a list of people that we have resentments toward. And there could well be overlap between those people and the people we've harmed.
One would think so, yes.
But it doesn't require it. There are certain politicians I can name that I have experienced resentments toward, and I don't to my knowledge, feel that I've harmed them, sometimes not even as much as I wanted in my smaller moments. So, in brief, I think those confusions are easy to happen, but not that hard to distinguish once one just looks thoughtfully at the two different functions. And again, I think it's probably not to fall hopelessly in love with this notion, but I think it's helpful to see these first 6 steps as being about discovering who I am. Okay, now I take that on the road. Take that show on the road.
Yes. Yeah.
And right away, the very first place that it turns up is in my relationships.
So in step 4, we're looking inward. In step 8, we're looking outward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in step 4 and step 5, there is a real, again, a turning over, a letting go, and admitting all of those processes that are not quite passive, but they're not willful, energetic things. Whereas in the 8th step of making a list, it's a very it's all about taking responsibility in particular forms, not in abstract forms. And then in the 9th step, where we go out and undertake to actually make amends, it's a very active step.
Before we move on to that, I just want to touch a bit on the becoming ready, or we're entirely ready to make amends. Became entirely ready to. Right. Yeah, and it's the entirely ready part that seems like another hurdle again. But there, perhaps it's just part of that natural progression.
Well, I suspect that the analogy of the being in the womb applies here as well. As just because we're entirely ready doesn't mean we're eager to do it. If you follow.
I do. Okay. All right. So step 9 says.
Let me, if I may, let me back off just one more moment. To use my favorite sort of provocative way of freeing people up in making their 8th step list, people they have harmed, because people can earnestly, if somewhat naively, imagine that not all that many people were harmed. And so what I recommend is, and quite genuinely, that people write a list of everyone they have ever known. And then review that list and think of why a given person might not belong on the list.
Well, that's an excellent place to leave it. We'll pick up step 9 when we next meet.
Great.
Thank you again for
my pleasure,
being here, Roget, and thank you for joining us on Come to Think of It. I hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm KC Scott.